Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. In this day, in this lecture, we are going to wind up our discussion on power and politics, particularly the theory and concept parts of it. And today happens to be the 10th class or the end of second week. Until now, we have discussed about what is hegemony, what are the different dimensions of power, what is power on the face and what is behind the back, what is legitimacy of a state and how legitimacy is created or constructed. Today's is the day when we are going to use many of these concepts from the perspective of an Indian scholar, and not just any Indian scholar. We are going to discuss it from the ideas and opinion of Professor Ranajit Guha or late Professor Ranajit Guha, who passed away very recently. He was the founding figure of Subaltern Studies Collective, which radically challenged the way historiography or history was written from the global south perspective. He wrote numerous articles, books, and each one of those articles and books became equally famous. He also edited several volumes of subaltern studies, and through this he initiated a project which is still going on, through which scholars, including myself, we try to challenge the dominant narratives through which history is understood, through which society is understood, through which power and politics is understood. Although predominantly Ranajit Guha was a historian, but his ideas and his works are very frequently used in political sociology, in political ecology, in sociology, in politics, in economics, and in history as such, to understand something which he called history from below, because everybody was speaking what was going on here. Even the history books that you might have gone through, or even non-history books that you might have gone through, everybody is speaking about big leaders. Everybody speaks about the rajas, maharajas, gods, princes, prince, dragons, whatnot. But his project was to speak about the subalterns, about the people who have been marginalized in the official discourse, created by elite nationalists as well as the colonial powers. So the elite, if you remember, we had discussed about the elite rule. The elites spoke about their own life, and Ranajit Guha wanted to read the same texts but against the grain or against the flow, to say what is it that these elitist nationalist and elitist colonial historiographers are writing about people at the bottom. What is it that they are writing about women? What is it that they are writing about Adivasis? What is it that they are writing about the backward classes? What is it that they are writing about the peasants or the subsistence farmers, so on and so forth. And subsequently, they also wrote about the Dalits, they also wrote about several other backward classes as well as the different kinds of people across global south. So let us start. He starts his argument by saying that this is a time to look at historiography from a critical point of view. And when he says from a critical point of view, he means that there are two dominant ways through which history has been written in the Indian subcontinent or across the global south. So, if this is the map of the world, global north and global south. Global north has North America, global north has Europe, global north has Japan, and global north has Australia and New Zealand. And everyone else, global north sometimes also the is Russia, and everyone else fall under global south. These are also global north are also the colonial powers and the colonized nations or colonies. Now, in each one of these sites, you see them creating a certain historiography. Historiography in the sense of census data, historiography in the sense of creating statistics, historical data or historiography in terms of what the bureaucrats are writing about their day-to-day activities. Historiography in the sense of positioning the north and the south, or the colonial powers and the colonies. What do these people feel about them? How do they feel about themselves? Do they feel that because I am an American, because I am a British, because I am a French, German, Swedish, so on and so forth, I am superior to the ones who are our colonies, who are our subjects? That is the reason why colonial historiography and the people who are part of this historiography justified British conquest of India, as well as conquest that happened throughout the global south. And in the Indian context, like that of the example which Ranjit Guha wants to speak about, he says it started from the post 1765 period, when the East India Company received the Diwani rights of Bengal, or it is also said Bihar, Bengal and Odisha, and the creation of Bengal presidency happened. So, when Diwani rights were created, the British employed its own people, also employed people who had supported the East Indian Company in its conquest, and the company wanted to rule by looking at the land records. They also wanted to look at our scriptures. They also wanted to look at our the Veds, Upanishads, our Purans and everything in between. Through this, they wanted to understand Indian society. Now, this is very interesting in terms of colonial historiography, because land records were maintained by a certain group of people. Whether it is our scriptures in terms of Vedas, Upanishads or Purans, they are written by certain groups of people, and over centuries new items had been added. So, through this Diwani, through this knowledge, a certain kind of knowledge was coming into existence, which were not so dominant beforehand. There might be splinter groups, but not so dominant. So, colonial historiography looked at each one of those documents and claimed that Indians were passive, traditional, and it is a static society, because no new invention is happening. People are the caste based, their entire life is based on caste. Some of those people, their entire life is based on religion or these primordial relationships rather than class aspect. Rather than creating something new, they are just static. They are living in what it was famously called as village republics. they are self-sufficient. Because they are self-sufficient, so these villages, they have no interlinkages. So if there are no interlinkages, that means, as Marx would call it, they are potatoes in a sack, or a sack of potatoes, because there are no linkages. And this is the beauty of the Indian subcontinent. And the beauty lies in creation of a society which is not civilizational. It doesn't have a civilization anymore. What civilization it had in the past, not in the present time, because everybody is living in their own village republics. It does not matter whether it is the Mughals, it does not matter whether it is the Hindu kings, it does not matter whether they are Jain kings or Buddhist kings, or they have come from outside, or they were there from the place itself, or it does not matter whether they are Marathas ruling over Bengal, or they are Cholas ruling over Odisha, because nothing was changing in the villages. That is the reason why it was static. And whatever modernization, whatever changes were happening, it happened because of the benevolence of the colonial rule. So in effect, the British conquest brought civilization to the traditional static society of passive traditional static society of India. If not for that, then would have remained backward forever. So in effect, it provided an ideological basis for colonial rule. You remember that we had spoken about Gramsci before, ideological basis. You remember in the last class we had discussed about Stephen Luke's third dimension of power. So ideological basis is very significant because this has the power to completely change the perspective about something. But the colonial historiography was challenged by the nationalist historiographers, who argue that colonialism did not bring civilization to the Indian subcontinent. We have a civilization, we have a cultural heritage which goes back to the Vedas, which is if not more at least 5,000 years old. So how can a society which is not even 500 years old, they come to our land and tell us that we are uncivilized, we do not have a cultural heritage. You might have heard the name of Swami Dayanand Saraswati and others of his period. They claimed that we have a cultural heritage, we have a civilization. So we need to show what is good about us, what has been happening about us. But according to Ranajit Guha, even when the nationalist historiographers were challenging or responding very critically to that of the colonial historiographers, they fell into the same trap, or they followed the same track regarding progress, tradition, binaries. So when Swami Dayanand Saraswati spoke about cultural heritage, he spoke about going back to the Vedas, because in the present period, particularly in the by the time of late 19th century, we Hindus or we Sanatanis or we Indians have forgotten our language, have forgotten our civilization, have forgotten our history, or particularly the cultural heritage that we have. The cultural heritage of the Vedas. That is the reason why he created Arya Samaj. And he was not the only one. Every group, whether it was Raja Ram Mohan Roy or others, they spoke the same language. And nationalist historiography was not just limited to them. The same ideas were also the same ideas that were created in terms of village republics as well as progress, tradition, binaries were also used by the nationalist leaders. Gandhi spoke about village republics as a timeless the entirety and the face of Indian subcontinent. But when he was doing or speaking about it, he was not referring to an actual entity that existed a few thousand years back or a few hundred years back. Rather, what he was doing was he was using the language of the colonial historiographers to speak to them. So, in an effect, according to Ranajit Guha, nationalist historiography, in its zeal and enthusiasm to respond to the colonialist appropriation history, did not critically interrogate colonial dominance. Colonial dominance meant that they spoke the same language about the colonial categories of law, progress, and modernity. In terms of modernity, not much of Gandhi, but certainly progress in a certain sense, certainly law in a certain sense. Why? Because Gandhi was a lawyer and he was trained in UK. So, he understood British law or the liberal British law and the liberal British idea of progress and modernity. But by showcasing himself in a different light, he wanted to use this law against the British. But according to Ranajit Guha, these colonial categories downplayed all the contributions that nationalist historiographers could make, because they shared the liberal ideas of the British elites. And the Indian elites and the British elites, they wanted to be identified as one class. So, neither the British elites nor the Indian elites spoke about the marginalized. And even if they spoke about the marginalized, about the subsistence economy, about similar kind of aspects, they used the same language. And the usage of this language was critical primarily because that language created the complexity in our understanding of the history itself. Ranajit Guha is also the questioning liberal historiography alongside national historiography as well as alongside colonial historiography, because what most of his criticism or polemics are reserved for the liberals, in which he argues that the liberals, in their zeal and enthusiasm to identify themselves or their knowledge systems with the British elites, forgot something very crucial, the specific aspect of the Indian colonial experience. When they were bringing ideas from European bourgeois liberalism, they forgot that it was an evolutionary shift that was happening there. The bourgeoisie in Western Europe, in England, they had come together, they have persuaded others, they had created a hegemony for themselves. Whereas in the Indian context, our liberals wanted to be like the British liberals. They wanted to import their ideas and use it here to an extent that whether it was a Congress party when it was formed in the late 19th century or it was other kind of parties and other individuals, they identified themselves with the liberal bourgeois. But they did not work for the local people in the way they should have worked or they must have worked. And at the same time, the liberal historiographers, the nationalist historiographers and the colonial historiographers, they all projected colonial dominance as hegemonic. The concept of hegemony, as we had discussed with Gramsci, was about rule through consent outweighing coercion. Coercion, consent, if you remember, we had already discussed about this in the previous classes. Even in the last class we had discussed about it. We had also discussed about Gramsci's idea of organic intellectuals and civil society, and how legitimacy is created which is beyond the regular usage of force. Now Guha is a very interesting scholar. Even when he is looking at it, or even when he is using something called dominance without hegemony, he is not exactly using Gramsci's idea of hegemony, because he wants to create something that is authentic to the Indian conditions rather than something that has been imported from the Italy or from continental Europe. The reason he is speaking about organic intellectuals and civil society is primarily because, as we had discussed before, organic intellectuals come from specific classes, and the specific classes, whether it is bourgeoisie or it is the working class, the hegemony and counter hegemony can proceed if organic intellectuals are working for their own communities or for their own classes. Now the organic intellectuals from colonial historiography were actual organic intellectuals because they were working for their own class, the class interest of the colonizers. Whereas the colonial post-colonial the historiography or that of other kind of historiographies, including liberal and the nationalist, they were not working for the interests of the large mass of people. Rather, they were also working for the interest of the classes they were coming from. The liberal historiographers or liberal organic intellectuals in India were working for their own interests. So they would collaborate with the British, they would collaborate with the Rajas and Maharajas rather than challenge them and uproot them like it was done in Europe. So the civil society that these organic intellectuals had created in the Indian situation were exclusive civil societies. It did not encompass great masses of people. So the legitimacy that the British Empire or British Raj had in the Indian context was never legitimized. So that is the reason why he claims that colonial domination was all about dominance without hegemony. The consent that was created was fragile, limited and imposed. Like the British, even the national bourgeoisie lacked hegemonic leadership because they were representing only their own class interests rather than the interests of the entire mass of people. He is excluding the Gandhi here in his critique, but he is bringing in other scholars, other intellectuals as well as other political leaders. Because in the 19th century, when Congress was one of the dominant forces which was fighting for the independence of India, they were not even fighting for the independence of India. Rather, they were the kind of the petitions they had filed, the kind of petitions other political organizations had filed. It was all about getting certain concessions from the British Raj, and these concessions were not concessions for the wider spectrum of population. Rather, it was for themselves. It was also for themselves because the framework of power relationship was quite crooked. Crooked in the sense that you have dominance, you have subordination, and how do you map it out? You map it out by presenting domination and subordination here. Domination, it can again have two channels. This could be through persuasion, this could be through coercion. And persuasion again can have multiple factors, and coercion can also have multiple factors, which essentially means that whenever there is domination, there is coercion plus persuasion. Wherever there is subordination, there is collaboration plus resistance. Now, if there is domination has the dominant aspect of coercion, but this coercion is also associated with a certain degree of persuasion, and this certain degree of persuasion was done or created through Macaulay's English language, through the abolition of sati and certain other benefits that were given to a certain educated class. But whether it was English, whether it was sati, it was for a very small minority rather than this entire majority population. And this minority became the bourgeoisie who supported, or through whose support this entire enterprise of British Raj functioned here. And the second aspect that he is talking about in terms of subordination is collaboration plus resistance. Now, when you have collaboration, that means you have learned English, now sati is banned, but what do you do with this English? Okay. So, what do you do with this English? You basically want to get a job. Now that you have a job, you want to climb up the ladder, but you are still living inside a colonized country as a subject, not a citizen, because you are living as a subject, not a citizen. So, there is a fixed, not just glass ceiling, there is a concrete ceiling here, beyond which a native can never move. So, even if there is collaboration, there is certain aspect of resistance, because you want to resist the idea that me, who is so good at my job, can never become the manager of that area or that office. In that sense, collaboration and resistance, they are part of this entire enterprise of the power play, which Ranjit Guha calls the general configuration of power in colonial India. For him, this is interesting primarily because, unlike the British historiographers, unlike the nationalist historiographers, as well as unlike the liberal historiographers, Ranjit Guha or subaltern historiography is under no obligation to give recognition to the British Raj for what it did not do. He argues that British Raj in India was never about hegemony, because the small class of people who were participant to the governance or rule of law in India, they are very small minority, and most often than not, all the other aspects of life were determined by danda, determined by repressive laws, determined by the army and the military. So, it was decree, bureaucracy and army through which the Indian subcontinent was ruled. It was through surveillance and censorship that everything was done. So, danda was used for order, and this danda was the danda of the police for repression. There were no political rights, there were no citizenship rights. So whatever the bourgeoisie or whatever the liberals had been saying, it was completely different on the ground. Probably nationalist leaders, even when they went to jail, they had a better life than the normal day-to-day lives of people who are living in rural areas. That is the reason why it was never a democracy. The English rule in India was never a democratic rule. It was an autocratic rule. That is the reason why the large mass of people in India never gave their consent to the colonial state. Even though the colonial state argued that they were part of a long line of rulers who ruled over the Indian subcontinent. Before them, it was the Mughals. Before Mughals, it was the Delhi Sultanate. Before Delhi Sultanate, it was other kind of groups. So there's no, they were not imposters, or they were not the invaders who have come here. They are there, so that is how they wanted to create a legitimacy for themselves. But the legitimacy they wanted was they got only from certain liberals, not from the masses or the subalterns. That is the reason why in the 19th century, more than 100 peasant revolts happened in the Indian countryside, and the British military was busy quelling these revolts. It was created by the peasants, it was created by tribals, it was created by different other groups, and it continued till the arrival of the Mahatma Gandhi to the scene. Even Chauri Chaura, the case of Chauri Chaura is part of this same equation of subalterns defying the call of the nationalist liberal leaders and doing what they know best. That fire is the best solution for the dominant groups. Put everything on fire and then we'll see what happens. So that is the reason why, as I have been saying, there's limit to persuasion. So social customs, laws, education, or whatever it is there, it was very selective, which failed to generate a broad-based consent. That is the reason why in the first half of the 20th century, there was massive fall down in law and order, as well as in the way legitimacy was created and constructed for the colonial state. And the nationalist bourgeoisie still wanted to get to the colonial patronage and structures. It did not confront, rather it was always willing to compromise. And this compromise was very significantly written about different groups of people who wanted to be with the British for one reason or the other. And as a matter of fact, when we say divide and rule, this is exactly what was about the colonial patronage and patronage structures. So irrespective of which group you are, you want to be closer to this colonial patronage. And as a matter of fact, even in the post-colonial period, the same thing goes on. Why do you want to get a house in Delhi? Why do you want to live in capital cities? Or why do you pursue your interest through your political leaders? It is primarily because of the patronage system that we have. So there was resistance, and there are number of resistance, and these resistance were based on dharma, or claimed to be based on dharma, custom and justice. And very interestingly, it was the subalterns who were speaking this language, not the nationalist bourgeoisie, not the nationalist liberals. So it is for example, it is a dharma of the colonial rulers to follow the ancient dharma that is there, to be kind towards people. to be kind towards following somebody's custom, to do proper justice. If there is a drought or there is a famine, taking revenue or imposing taxes on people is against dharma and against justice. So the colonial power should follow it up. If not, then there is a breakdown of dharma and people are going to revolt against it. Don't take away our land, because that is against custom, that is against justice. If you are doing it, then we are going to fight against you. So subaltern resistance took many forms, both everyday resistance as well as tribal uprisings and peasant insurgencies. Everyday resistance could be the very informal, many times it's been difficult to see. One of them would be that every time a British colonial officer would come, or a representative of British colonial officers would come, all the tribals will just flee to the forests. So this was one of the everyday forms of resistance. It's not that they are afraid of the colonial officers, rather they want them to see an empty village or empty hamlet. So that is the reason why Guha calls for the history to be written from a subaltern perspective. The small people of history, how they lived, what they thought about, and what they did was crucial for all of us to understand, for all of us to know. So in conclusion, subaltern studies is about understanding or recovering histories of the ruled. As I said, what they have been doing, how they have been doing, when they are fighting, when they are being persuasive, and what are the different strands that they have taken, the different colors their protests and their other aspects have taken. We need to know about it. That is when the history would be holistic. It would not be a history of the Rajas and the Maharajas or the nationalist leaders. It will also be the history of the peasants, of women, of Dalits, of Adivasis, of backward classes, so on and so forth. So these are some of the questions that you can go through. For example, how is Guha's concept different from Gramsci's hegemony? Why does Guha argue that both colonialist and nationalist historiography represented power? Can we see dominance without hegemony in post-colonial regimes? How does the DS framework help analyze colonial India, and what does Guha's critique imply for writing subaltern history? If you like, we can take up some of these questions in the forum and also discuss them in our live sessions. And this is the key text that you can go through. It is one of the most important works of our time. Thank you.